A baby floating in a basket on a river, an 80-year-old man standing before a burning bush, 10 plagues that brought the most powerful nation on earth to its knees, and a sea that split in half so millions could walk through on dry ground. But here's what most people miss. Moses didn't want any of this. In fact, he tried to run away from God 5 times, and yet God still used him. Why? You've probably heard bits and pieces of Moses' story before. The basket on the Nile, the 10 plagues, the parting of the Red Sea. But what you might not know is how a man who murdered someone, ran away for 40 years, and had a speech problem, became the deliverer of an entire nation. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to walk through the complete story of Moses, and by the end, you'll see something that changed everything for me personally. God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. Even when you think you're the worst choice, even when you've messed up, even when you feel completely unworthy. Let's begin. About 400 years before Moses was born, a man named Joseph saved Egypt from a devastating famine. Because of Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh welcomed Joseph's entire family into Egypt. They were treated like honored guests. They had land, they had freedom, they had peace. But 400 years is a long time, and people forget. By the time Moses' story begins, everything had changed. The Pharaoh who loved Joseph was long dead, and the new Pharaoh? He didn't care about Joseph. He didn't care about the promises made to the Israelites. All he saw was a problem. The Israelites had grown a lot. What started as 70 people had become over 1 million, maybe even 2 million. They were strong, they were healthy, they were everywhere, and Pharaoh was terrified. He thought to himself, what if war breaks out? What if these Israelites team up with our enemies? What if they turn against us? So he made a decision, a cruel one. He turned the Israelites into slaves. Imagine waking up one day and suddenly you're no longer free. You're forced to carry heavy stones under the burning sun. You're whipped if you slow down. You work from sunrise to sunset, building cities for a king who hates you. Your children watch you suffer. Your body aches. Your spirit breaks. And no matter how hard you work, it's never enough. The Egyptians treated the Israelites like animals. They beat them. They mocked them. They worked them until their bodies gave out. But here's the thing. Even in the middle of all that suffering, something strange happened. The Israelites kept multiplying. The more Pharaoh oppressed them, the more they grew. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers. Pharaoh's plan wasn't working, and that made him furious. So he came up with a new plan, a darker one. He called 2 Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah before him and gave them a horrifying order. Every time a Hebrew woman gives birth to a boy, kill him. Let the girls live, but the boys must die. Can you imagine being told to do something like that? These were women whose job was to bring life into the world, and now they were being commanded to take it away. But Shiphrah and Puah feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, so they refused. They let the baby boys live. And when Pharaoh questioned them, they lied to protect the children. They said, Hebrew women are strong. They give birth so quickly that we can't get there in time. Pharaoh didn't believe them, so he made the command public. He told everyone in Egypt, if you see a Hebrew baby boy, throw him into the Nile River. This was genocide, this was evil, and this was the world Moses was born into. But what his mother did next would shock everyone, including Pharaoh's own daughter. During this time of terror, a woman named Jochebed gave birth to a son. The Bible says she saw that he was beautiful. Now, every mother thinks her baby is beautiful, but there was something different about this child, something special. Jochebed knew she had to protect him. For 3 months she hid him. Can you imagine the fear? Every time the baby cried, she must have panicked. Every knock on the door must have felt like the end. How do you keep a baby quiet when soldiers are walking through the streets looking for Hebrew boys? How do you hide a child in a community where everyone knows everyone? But babies grow. They get louder. They need more space. And after 3 months, Jochebed knew she couldn't hide him anymore. So she came up with a plan, a desperate plan. A plan that required faith. She took a basket, not just any basket, but one made from papyrus reeds. The same kind of plant that grew along the Nile. She wove it carefully. Then she covered it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof. This wasn't just a basket. It was a tiny ark. In fact, the Hebrew word used here for basket is the same word used for Noah's Ark. Think about that for a second. Both were covered with pitch. Both were designed to save a life from the water. Both were a picture of God's protection in the middle of judgment. And here's what gets me every time I read this story. Jochebed placed her baby boy inside the basket. Can you imagine what that moment was like? The tears streaming down her face as she kissed his forehead one last time. The way her hands must have trembled as she placed him in the water. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. She didn't know if he would live or die. All she knew was that she had to trust God. Let me be honest with you. I used to think faith meant having all the answers. I thought it meant being confident and sure about everything. But Jochebed's story taught me something different. Faith isn't the absence of fear. Faith is trusting God even when your hands are shaking, even when you don't understand, even when it looks like you're sending your child to his death. She set the basket among the reeds at the edge of the Nile River, the same river where Pharaoh had ordered Hebrew boys to drown. The place of death was about to become the place of life. And then Jochebed walked away. But she didn't leave him completely alone. His older sister Miriam stayed nearby, watching, waiting, praying. Soon after, something incredible happened. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river to bathe. Of all the people who could have found that basket, it was her, the daughter of the very man who ordered the death of Hebrew boys. As she walked along the bank of the Nile with her attendants, she noticed something unusual in the reeds. She sent one of her servants to retrieve it. When she opened the basket, the baby was crying, and in that moment something shifted in her heart. The Bible says she felt sorry for him. Compassion flooded her soul. She looked at this crying Hebrew baby and she knew. She knew he was one of the children her father had condemned to death. But instead of obeying her father's command, she chose mercy. Think about this like a chess game. Pharaoh thought he had Moses in checkmate before he was even born. Death sentence, no way out. But God moved a piece Pharaoh never saw coming, his own daughter. The one person in all of Egypt who could protect a Hebrew baby without question. God didn't just save Moses, he placed him in the very house of his enemy, right under Pharaoh's nose. This is where Miriam's bravery comes in. She had been watching from a distance the entire time, and when she saw Pharaoh's daughter pick up the baby, she didn't run away. She ran toward her. Can you imagine the courage that took? This was a young Hebrew girl approaching an Egyptian princess. She could have been punished. She could have been killed. But she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about her baby brother. Miriam walked up to the princess and said, "Should I go and find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for you?" Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Pharaoh's daughter agreed. And who do you think Miriam brought back? Their own mother, Jochebed. The same woman who had placed her son in the basket just hours earlier was now being paid by Pharaoh's daughter to take care of him. Do you see what God did here? The enemy tried to kill Moses, but God used the enemy's own daughter to save him. Not only that, Moses got to stay with his real family for the first few years of his life. He was nursed by his own mother. He heard stories about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He learned that he was a Hebrew, and all of this happened under Pharaoh's nose. When Moses was old enough, Jochebed brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, and she adopted him as her own son. She named him Moses, which means drawn out, because she drew him out of the water. So Moses, who was born a Hebrew slave, grew up as an Egyptian prince. He lived in the palace. He had the best education. He learned Egyptian wisdom, military strategy, and leadership. He had access to power and wealth, but deep down, he never forgot who he really was. And that identity crisis would lead to a decision that changed everything. A decision that forced him to run for his life. Moses grew up in two worlds, Egyptian on the outside, Hebrew on the inside. And one day, when he was around 40 years old, he decided to visit his people. He wanted to see how they were doing, and what he saw broke his heart. He saw the brutal slavery, the beatings, the oppression, and then he witnessed something that changed everything. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, beating him viciously, maybe even to death. Moses looked around. No one was watching, and something inside him snapped. He killed the Egyptian. He buried him in the sand, and he thought no one would ever know. But the next day, Moses saw two Hebrew men fighting each other. He tried to step in and make peace, but one of the men said something that made his blood run cold. Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you planning to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" Moses' secret was out. People knew what he had done. And if people knew, Pharaoh would find out. Moses had no choice. He had to run. He fled Egypt and ended up in a land called Midian, which was located in the Arabian desert, east of Egypt. Here's something most people don't realize. Moses spent 40 years in Pharaoh's palace, learning to be somebody. And then he spent 40 years in the desert, learning to be nobody. That second part, that was just as important as the first. Because God doesn't use people who think they have it all figured out. He uses broken people who know they need him. When Moses arrived in Midian, he was exhausted. He sat down by a well to rest. And while he was sitting there, 7 young women came to draw water for their father's flocks. But a group of shepherds showed up and started harassing them. They tried to drive the women away so they could water their own flocks first. Moses couldn't just sit there and watch. So he stood up and defended the women. He drove the shepherds away and helped the women water their flocks. When the women went home, their father, Reuel, also called Jethro, was surprised. "Why are you back so early today?" he asked. They told him, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." Notice that. They called him an Egyptian, not a Hebrew. Moses was still hiding who he really was, still running from his identity, still trying to blend in. Reuel said, "Where is he? Why did you leave him out there? Go invite him to eat with us." So Moses stayed. And eventually, Reuel gave one of his daughters, Zipporah, to Moses as his wife. Moses became a shepherd. He settled into a quiet life in the wilderness. He had a wife. He had children. He was far away from Egypt, far away from Pharaoh, far away from his past. 40 years passed. Moses was now 80 years old. He had spent 40 years in Pharaoh's palace and 40 years in the desert. And just when it seemed like his story was over, God showed up in the most unexpected way. And what God asked him to do seemed absolutely impossible. One day, Moses was tending his father-in-law's flock near Mount Horeb, also called Mount Sinai. And that's when he saw it, a bush on fire. But the fire wasn't consuming the bush. It kept burning, but the bush wasn't turning to ash. Moses had never seen anything like it. He said to himself, "I need to go check this out. Why isn't that bush burning up?" As he got closer, he heard a voice. "Moses, Moses." Moses stopped. "Here I am." The voice said, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, because the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses obeyed. And then the voice continued, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face. He was terrified. He was standing in the presence of the Almighty God. God said, "I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries. I know their pain, and I have come down to rescue them. I am going to bring them out of Egypt and into a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And Moses, I am sending you to Pharaoh. You are going to bring my people out of Egypt." Moses couldn't believe what he was hearing. Him? Go back to Egypt? Face Pharaoh? Lead the Israelites out of slavery? He immediately started making excuses. And here's where the story gets real. Because Moses didn't just make one excuse, he made 5. 5 separate attempts to get out of what God was calling him to do. Excuse number 1. Who am I to do this? I'm nobody. I'm just a shepherd. God said, I will be with you. Excuse number 2. But what if they don't believe me? What if they ask who sent me? What do I tell them? God said, tell them I am has sent you. I am who I am. The God who always has been and always will be. The self-existing, eternal, all-powerful God. That's who is sending you. Excuse number 3. What if they don't listen to me? So God gave him signs. He told Moses to throw his staff on the ground. Moses did, and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back in fear. Then God told him to pick it up by the tail. Moses hesitated, but he obeyed. The snake turned back into a staff. Then God told Moses to put his hand inside his cloak. When Moses pulled it out, his hand was covered with leprosy, white as snow. God told him to put it back in. When Moses pulled it out again, his hand was completely healed. God said, show these signs to the people. If they don't believe the first sign, they'll believe the second. And if they don't believe either of those, take water from the Nile and pour it on the ground. It will turn to blood. Excuse number 4. Lord, I'm not a good speaker. I'm slow of speech. I can't do this. Here's where I see myself in Moses. How many times have I looked at what God was calling me to do and said, I can't. I'm not good enough. I don't have the skills. I don't have the talent. And you know what I learned? God isn't looking for ability. He's looking for availability. He doesn't need your talent. He needs your yes. God's patience was wearing thin. He said, who made your mouth? Who makes someone able to speak or not speak? Isn't it me? Now go. I will help you speak. But Moses wasn't done yet. Excuse number 5. Please, Lord, send someone else. God was angry now, but he didn't give up on Moses. He said, fine. Your brother Aaron is a good speaker. He's already on his way to meet you. He will speak for you, but you will still be the one I use to lead my people. Moses finally said yes. He went back to Jethro and asked permission to return to Egypt. Jethro agreed. So Moses took his wife and sons and started the journey back to the land he had fled 40 years earlier. On the way, he met Aaron in the wilderness. The two brothers embraced, and together they headed toward Egypt. But Moses had no idea what was waiting for him. Pharaoh wasn't going to give up his slaves without a fight, and what God was about to do would be remembered for thousands of years. When Moses and Aaron arrived in Egypt, they first went to the Israelites. They gathered the elders and told them everything God had said. Then Aaron performed the signs God had given them. The staff turned into a snake. Moses' hand became leprous and then healed. The people believed. They bowed down and worshipped God because he had finally heard their cries. But the hard part was just beginning. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh's palace. They stood before the most powerful man in the world and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they can worship me in the wilderness." Pharaoh looked at them like they were crazy. He said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him? I don't know this Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Not only did Pharaoh refuse, but he made things worse for the Israelites. He ordered the taskmasters to stop giving them straw to make bricks. Now they had to gather their own straw and still produce the same number of bricks each day. The workload became unbearable. The Israelites were furious with Moses. They said, "You've made things worse for us. Now Pharaoh hates us even more." Moses was discouraged. He cried out to God, "Why did you send me? Nothing has changed. Things are worse than before." But God reassured him, "You're about to see what I will do to Pharaoh. I will force him to let my people go." And so it began. The 10 plagues. 10 demonstrations of God's power. 10 judgments against Egypt and its gods. And here's something most people miss. Each plague wasn't random. Each one was a direct attack on an Egyptian god. God was showing Egypt that their gods were powerless. Plague 1. Water turned to blood. Moses and Aaron went to the Nile River early in the morning when Pharaoh came down to bathe. Aaron raised his staff and struck the water. Instantly, the entire Nile turned to blood. The fish died. The river stank. The water was undrinkable. The Egyptians had to dig wells to find water. Now here's what's interesting. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a god. They called it Hapi, the god of life and fertility. By turning the Nile to blood, God was saying, "Your God is dead. I am the one who controls life and death." But Pharaoh's magicians copied the miracle using their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Plague 2. Frogs. God sent frogs, millions of them. They came out of the Nile and invaded homes, bedrooms, kitchens, ovens, and even Pharaoh's palace. They were everywhere. The Egyptians worshipped a frog goddess named Heket, the goddess of fertility and childbirth. God was showing them that even their goddess of life could bring death and chaos. Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Ask your God to take away the frogs, and I will let the people go." But as soon as the frogs died, Pharaoh changed his mind. Plague 3. Gnats. Aaron struck the dust of the ground with his staff, and gnats swarmed over all of Egypt. They covered people and animals. Even Pharaoh's magicians admitted, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh still refused. Plague 4. Flies. Swarms of flies filled Egyptian homes and covered the land. But in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there were no flies. God was making a distinction between his people and the Egyptians. Think of it like this. Imagine you're in a room full of smoke. Everyone around you is coughing and choking, but you're standing in a bubble of clean air. That's what God did for the Israelites. He protected them while judging Egypt. Pharaoh tried to negotiate. He said, "Fine, sacrifice to your God, but do it here in Egypt." Moses refused. Pharaoh said, "Okay, go, but don't go far." Moses said no. The flies remained until Pharaoh agreed to let them go, but once the flies were gone, Pharaoh hardened his heart again. Plague 5. Death of livestock. A severe plague struck all the Egyptian livestock. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats died. The Egyptians worshipped a bull god named Apis. God was showing them that even their most sacred animal couldn't save itself. But not a single animal belonging to the Israelites was harmed. Still, Pharaoh refused. Plague 6. Boils. God told Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a furnace and throw it into the air. When they did, painful boils broke out on the Egyptians and their animals. Even Pharaoh's magicians were covered in boils and couldn't stand before Moses. But Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Plague 7. Hail. God sent a storm unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. Thunder roared, lightning flashed, hail fell from the sky, destroying crops, trees, and livestock left in the fields. The Egyptians worshipped a sky goddess named Nut. God was proving that he controlled the heavens, not her. Only in Goshen was there no hail. Pharaoh admitted, "I have sinned. The Lord is in the right. Let the people go." But once the storm stopped, he changed his mind again. Plague 8. Locusts. A swarm of locusts covered Egypt. They ate everything the hail had left behind, every green plant, every tree, every blade of grass. Egypt was stripped bare. Pharaoh's officials begged him to let the Israelites go. "Don't you see that Egypt is ruined?" they said. Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Fine, go worship your God, but only the men can go." Moses refused. Pharaoh kicked them out of his palace. Plague 9. Darkness. For 3 days, thick darkness covered Egypt. It was so dark that people couldn't see anything. They couldn't move. They stayed where they were. The Egyptians worshipped Ra, the sun god. He was their most powerful deity, and God turned off the sun for 3 days. He was saying, "Your most powerful God is nothing compared to me." But the Israelites had light in their homes. Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Go, worship your God. Take your families, but leave your livestock behind." Moses said, "No, we need our animals to sacrifice to God." Pharaoh exploded in anger. He shouted, "Get out of my sight! If I ever see your face again, you will die." Moses replied, "You're right, you will never see my face again." But there was one more plague, the worst one, the final one. And what happened next would change the course of history forever. God told Moses, "I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and Egypt. After this, he will let you go. In fact, he will drive you out of here. Around midnight, I will pass through Egypt. Every firstborn son will die. From Pharaoh's son to the son of the slave girl, even the firstborn of the livestock, there will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not even a dog will bark. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." But God gave the Israelites special instructions. Each family was to take a lamb without defect. On the 14th day of the month, they were to slaughter the lamb at twilight. They were to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of their houses. Then they were to roast the lamb and eat it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. They were to eat in haste, dressed and ready to leave. God said, "This is the Passover. When I see the blood on the doorframe, I will pass over that house. The plague will not touch you." Now here's something powerful. The lamb had to be without defect, perfect, spotless, and its blood had to be placed on the doorframe. Does this sound familiar? Thousands of years later, another perfect lamb would shed his blood, not on a doorframe, but on a cross, Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The Passover wasn't just about escaping Egypt, it was pointing forward to the ultimate deliverance from sin and death. That night, the Israelites obeyed. They killed the lambs. They painted the blood on their doorposts. They ate the meal in silence, knowing what was about to happen. And at midnight, it began. The angel of death passed through Egypt, and in every Egyptian home, from the palace to the poorest house, the firstborn son died. Pharaoh's own son, the son of the prisoner in the dungeon, the firstborn of the cattle. A loud cry rose up in Egypt. There was not a single house without someone dead. But in the homes of the Israelites, there was peace. The blood on the doorposts had saved them. Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. His voice was broken. His heart was shattered. He said, "Go, leave, take your people, your livestock, everything. Just go, and bless me also." The Egyptians urged the Israelites to hurry. They gave them silver, gold, and clothing, anything to make them leave faster. And so, after 430 years in Egypt, the Israelites walked out, free. The Bible says about 600,000 men left, not counting women and children. That means the total number was probably around 2 million people, a massive crowd. They took their flocks, their herds, and the bones of Joseph, just as he had made them promise generations earlier. God led them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He was with them every step of the way. They were finally free. They were heading to the promised land, but the journey was far from over, because just when they thought they had escaped, Pharaoh changed his mind one more time. And what happened next became the most famous miracle in all of the Bible. A few days after the Israelites left, Pharaoh had a change of heart. He realized what he had done. He had let go of an entire nation of slaves. His economy was ruined. His pride was crushed. So he gathered 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, and he went after them. The Israelites were camped by the Red Sea when they saw the Egyptian army approaching in the distance. Panic swept through the camp. They were trapped. The sea was in front of them. The army was behind them. Mountains were on both sides. There was no way out. The people turned on Moses. They cried out, "Why did you bring us out here to die in the desert? Weren't there enough graves in Egypt? It would have been better to stay as slaves than to die out here." And here's the moment that gets me every time. Moses was standing there, hearing the people blame him, seeing the army getting closer, looking at the sea with no bridge, no boats, no way across. And he had every reason to panic, every reason to say, "God, I told you I was the wrong guy for this." But instead, Moses stood firm. He said, "Don't be afraid. Stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You just need to be still." That's faith. Not in yourself, not in your ability, but in God's promise. Moses didn't know how God was going to rescue them. He just knew that he would. Then God spoke to Moses. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move forward. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea. The water will divide, and the Israelites will walk through on dry ground." Moses obeyed. He lifted his staff over the sea, and then it happened. A strong east wind began to blow. All night long the wind blew, and the waters of the Red Sea began to part. The water stood up like walls on both sides, and a path of dry ground appeared in the middle. Imagine this. You're standing at the edge of an ocean, waves crashing, water stretching as far as you can see, and suddenly the water starts pulling back. It rises up on both sides like frozen walls, and between those walls, the ocean floor is dry, completely dry. You can see fish flopping on the sand, shells scattered everywhere, and in front of you is a path. The Israelites walked through. 2 million people, walking on dry ground in the middle of the sea, walls of water on their left and right. It must have been terrifying and awe-inspiring at the same time. Children holding their parents' hands, elderly people leaning on their staffs, livestock moving forward, everyone trusting that God would hold the water back. The Egyptians saw what was happening and chased after them. Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen rushed into the sea, but God threw them into confusion. The wheels of their chariots came off. The soldiers started to panic. They said, "Let's get out of here! The Lord is fighting for the Israelites against us!" But it was too late. The Israelites reached the other side safely. And then God said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea again." Moses did, and the walls of water came crashing down. The entire Egyptian army was swallowed up by the sea. Pharaoh, his soldiers, his chariots, all of them, gone. Not a single one survived. The Israelites stood on the other side and watched. They saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the shore. They saw the power of God with their own eyes, and they worshipped. Moses' sister Miriam took a tambourine and led the women in singing and dancing. They sang, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." God had done it. He had delivered his people, just as he promised. But the story doesn't end here, because what happened in the years that followed would test their faith in ways they never imagined. Moses' story didn't end at the Red Sea. God led the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 years. He gave them the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. He fed them with manna from heaven. He brought water out of a rock. He protected them from their enemies. He was faithful every single day. But the Israelites? They complained a lot. They grumbled about the food. They grumbled about the water. They even built a golden calf to worship while Moses was on the mountain talking to God. What should have been an 11-day journey turned into 40 years of wandering because they refused to trust God. And Moses himself was not allowed to enter the promised land. Because at one point, when the people complained about water, God told Moses to speak to a rock and water would come out. But Moses, in frustration and anger, struck the rock twice with his staff instead. It was an act of disobedience, and because of it, God told Moses he could see the promised land from a distance, but he could not enter it. That hurt me when I first read it. Moses had given everything. He had led these people for 40 years. He had put up with their complaints, their rebellion, their unbelief, and because of one moment of anger, he couldn't enter the land God had promised. It seemed unfair. But here's what I learned. God is merciful, but he's also just. And even our heroes have moments of failure. Even the greatest leaders make mistakes. Moses climbed Mount Nebo. God showed him the land he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then Moses died peacefully. The Bible says God himself buried Moses, and no one knows where his grave is to this day. Think about that. The God of the universe personally buried his servant. That's an honor. That's love. But Moses' legacy lived on. He was a man who started as a baby in a basket and became the greatest leader Israel ever knew. A man who spoke to God face to face. A man who delivered millions from slavery. A man who showed the world that when God makes a promise, he keeps it. And the same God who was faithful to Moses is faithful to you. No matter what you're facing, no matter how trapped you feel, no matter how impossible it seems, God is able. God is powerful, and God never abandons his people. Even when you feel unqualified, even when you've messed up, even when you think there's no way out, God can use you, just like he used Moses. Because here's the truth that changed my perspective on everything. Moses wasn't chosen because he was perfect. He was a murderer who ran away. He had a speech problem. He argued with God. He made excuses. He got angry and disobeyed. And yet God still called him the most humble man on earth. God still used him to do the impossible. That tells me something powerful. God doesn't need your perfection. He needs your willingness. He doesn't need you to have it all together. He just needs you to say yes. Even when you're scared, even when you don't understand, even when it seems like the Red Sea is in front of you and Pharaoh's army is behind you. Because the same God who parted the Red Sea for Moses can make a way for you. The same God who turned water into blood, who sent manna from heaven, who spoke from a burning bush, is still working today. He's still faithful. He's still powerful. And he's still in the business of doing the impossible. So maybe you're facing your own Egypt right now. Maybe you feel trapped. Maybe you feel like God has forgotten about you. Maybe you've been waiting 40 years for something to change. Let me remind you of something. God heard the cries of the Israelites after 430 years. He didn't forget them. He was working behind the scenes the entire time, preparing a deliverer, setting up the pieces, getting ready to show his power. He's doing the same thing in your life right now. You may not see it, you may not understand it, but God is faithful. And when the time is right, he will part your Red Sea. He will make a way where there seems to be no way. He will deliver you, just like he delivered Moses, just like he delivered the Israelites, just like he's been delivering his people for thousands of years. So don't give up. Don't lose hope. Keep walking. Keep trusting. Keep believing, because your deliverance is coming. Your breakthrough is on the way. And when it happens, you'll look back and see that God was with you the entire time. In the basket, in the wilderness, at the Red Sea, and on the other side. That's the story of Moses, a story of God's faithfulness, a story of impossible odds and miraculous deliverance, a story that reminds us that no matter what we're facing, God is bigger, God is stronger, and God never fails. If this story encouraged you today, subscribe to see more incredible Bible stories that will strengthen your faith.